Hello, in this episode we're going to examine the urban informal sector. Just as a stylized fact to begin with, cities in developing countries, especially low and lower middle income countries, tend to have large informal sectors, areas in which productivity is lower, incomes are lower, and institutions are more informal, less regularized, and in general, quite often enough, less inclusive than in the modern areas of the developing countries. Cities, these often represent a third of the total urban population, and in some cases, depending upon how this is defined, half or even approaching 2/3 in some cases. One set of estimates for the case of India, the urban informal sector comprised 28% of employment. In Kolkata, over 46% in Ahmedabad, nearly 50% in Mumbai, over 53% in Chennai, over 60% in Delhi, and 65% or more in Bangalore. So we find that there's a lot of people working in these sectors, and indeed some people deliberately migrate from rural areas specifically to work in the urban informal sector. Some go there for the opportunities that they provide. Much of migration is oriented toward the hope of getting a good, higher paying, formal sector, modern, perhaps industrial job. But some are going to the informal sector for the opportunities there, and others as a last resort, where they don't get other opportunities working out as they had hoped. And in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, a survey found that there was half and half. About half were in the informal sector for opportunity that they saw there, and half because they didn't have a better alternative. In general, there are dramatic contrasts that you can see between the modern urban core of the city and the informal sector. And accordingly, a dualistic analysis, such as seen in the framework in chapter 3 of the textbook, has been applied to the urban economy, decomposing that economy into two parts, the modern sector and the traditional sector, or the formal and the informal, or as sometimes called, the superior and inferior sectors, to use a dependency term. The informal sector is characterized by low productivity and incomes, as I mentioned, in addition to very poor conditions, as you might guess, in rural areas, given what I have said, as well as in the context of these less formal and often less inclusive institutions. So despite some decades, if you want, of neglect in many cases, under-emphasizing services for those areas, in some cases outright hostility, where the informal sector areas are not even considered even there, if you want, from the point of view of government services. Despite all of this, there has been some ongoing informal sector development that suggests certainly that it plays an important role to ongoing growth in these developing country cities. So there's some important linkages going on with the informal sector out to the rural areas and to the formal parts of the urban environment here. Linkages with the rural sector. This sometimes allows for an escape for labor from rural, ultra-poverty, very oppressive conditions, to be able to go to the city and even be part of the informal economy there. Living and working conditions and incomes for such people are often closer to the poverty line than they were at home. Still quite likely in poverty, but less ultra-poverty, if you want. Migrants also often send money home and return for visits, sometimes extended visits. Linkages with the formal urban sector are very important as well. This provides cheap inputs for the formal sector. On the other hand, the informal sector produces low cost goods with the low wages of those who work there, which can be purchased by workers in the formal sector, otherwise lowering the wages that would have to be paid there. But if incomes are remaining higher in competitive urban than rural informal work, at least in some cases, then this likely reflects higher productivities in these circumstances in the urban informal sector than in these parts of the rural economy that workers sometimes migrate away from. And then it's also important to note that the informal sector depends on the formal sector in a variety of ways for income, for clientele, for its activities. So looking at production and labor characteristics, we usually see individual or family-owned production and service activities, usually using simpler technologies and techniques, more labor-intensive technology. The workers very often create their own employment in some way or another, or work for some small-scale, generally family-owned enterprises. Workers there have less formal education, certainly, than in the formal sector. They're generally unskilled or less skilled, at least. They lack access to financial capital. And so the informal sector job types are described in chapter 5 in the text, but there's a very wide range of possibilities, various kinds of informal mechanical work, carpentry, small artisans, barbers, letter writers, personal servants, hawkers, vendors, sellers at marketplaces, as well as various illegal activities. And some of the entrepreneurs in the urban informal sector do become quite successful, at least having a few employees, often relatives, and higher incomes, certainly than when they started out in the city. A few even graduate to the formal sector, though rarer. At this point, they become legally registered and licensed, and they're subject to labor regulations, at least in principle, if not always fully, at least in practice. But informal sector workers lack protections. They lack job security. They typically lack decent working conditions, lack pensions, certainly. They often work very long hours. So then, considering the residential areas, one characteristic is that there are poor property rights at all, and certainly a lack of enforcement of even the property rights that exist. Some research has shown that this can even lead some family members missing out on work opportunities outside of the home because someone needs to stay there to demark that this is their property, to avoid it being taken by other people, possibly even during the day. In some cases, there's usually very basic housing. Possibly one of the most common types to observe are small cinder block type dwellings, typically built by the owners themselves. But often this housing is unsafe in various ways, and it also includes shacks as well as really informally constructed structures. They often lack very minimal public services in these neighborhoods. Certainly that may include electricity, piped water, drainage, your basic sanitation, transportation. Public transportation often doesn't come out to these areas. Often there's a lack of health services available in these neighborhoods, at least on a comparative basis. Many of these neighborhoods are vulnerable to severe storms such as cyclones, storm surges of water, sometimes mudslides that can result in deaths, and other disasters caused by extreme weather. As you undoubtedly know, there is very clear evidence that these phenomena are worsening and will continue to worsen, particularly in Africa and in South Asia, as climate change brought about by global warming continues, and this is examined in a lot more detail in chapter 10. So then, with regard to policies, briefly, so even in a hostile policy environment in which the informal sector areas of the city have been largely ignored, given only minimal services, and sometimes met with active hostility. Sometimes we see these sectors thriving, and so this suggests the sector can be beneficial to overall economic growth in the city. And this is something to pay close attention to. And in fact, policies and programs designed to support and, as we might say, level the playing field for the informal sector have been successful in many cases, such as by regularizing property rights for those who have already built houses and have lived there for some time. For example, we want to develop realistic urban policies accepting the existence of these parts of the city. That's pretty basic, but also facilitating this informal sector role that we've been talking about. Providing better access to credit. Microfinance has done that to some extent, and that's a topic examined in Chapter 15 in Finance and Economic Development. In some cases, what's needed is access to foreign exchange. Access to improved technology, though, is critical, and it's necessary to leverage the advantages of the sector's low capital intensity, given the general capital scarcity and costs in the economy. So finally, we want to build on the informal sector's ability to provide access to effective practical training and apprenticeships at low costs. Much of what is learned in terms of job skills comes from working in different activities, really on the job, or just in terms of your own interaction with people in the course of the day. And so this is quite important to note. Facilitate the sector's absorption of semi-skilled and unskilled labor so that it has higher productivity and income. Focus policies to improve conditions for urban women, who often represent a majority of the informal sector labor supply, but who work for lower wages in more unstable jobs, we can say, with few or no benefits, very often living in poverty. Policy has to pay attention, immediate attention, top priority attention to conditions of women working in the informal sector and living in informal neighborhoods. In the residential areas, then, we have to provide basic infrastructure, public services. This can also help with overall poverty reduction in the multidimensional sense, including health and so on. And these policies, on the other hand, need to be paired with improving institutions, not just in the urban informal sector, but very importantly, improve institutions and opportunities in rural areas. So otherwise the result could be, quote, too much, unquote, migration from rural to urban areas for a country's stage in economic development. That is to say, an economically inefficient amount of migration taking place because of the failure to allow for investment in rural areas, to improve institutions so they're more inclusive in rural areas. So that one of the key implications of much of the analysis of cities in developing countries, in addition to understanding their vital and central role in raising productivity, is that there's a very strong set of reasons to invest in the rural areas as well, which is a focus in the text of Chapter 9. Thank you.